I have spent the last 8 weeks trying to find the moment it clicked for me. I was reading after-action reports from the Australian SAS in Phuoc Tuy Province, dry, bureaucratic documents filed by men who had just spent 10 days alone in triple canopy jungle. When I kept hitting this same phrase over and over, simulated larger force, I didn't understand it at first. These were 4-man patrols. How do you simulate a larger force with 4 men and 4 rifles? And then I found the answer. And when I found it, I sat back and realized I was looking at one of the most audacious tactical decisions of the entire Vietnam War. Not a general's decision, not a politician's. A decision made by a sergeant, loading a magazine somewhere in the dark. September 1969. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. 4 men. Moving through jungle so dense, the canopy above them had closed out the sky entirely. They had been in the field for 6 days. They had eaten cold rations from cans, spoken in hand signals, and slept in shifts. Their boots had not been dry since the 2nd day. The temperature was 34 degrees, and the humidity sat on them like a physical weight. The patrol commander, a SAS sergeant whose name appears in the after-action report only by rank and call sign, had sent his lead scout forward. What the scout found stopped him cold. Fresh tracks, a lot of them. He counted boot prints in the mud, estimated, and came back to signal to the commander. He held up both hands, then again, then a 3rd time. 30 men, maybe more. 4 Australians, 30+ NVA regulars. Standard operating procedure at that moment would have been clear to any soldier in any army. Break contact, evade, radio your position, wait for extraction or reinforcement. That was the rational response. The sergeant did something else. He signaled his men to reload. Not with standard magazines. Not with the 4-to-1 mix of ball and tracer that every other soldier in that war carried as a matter of routine. He had his men load magazines they had prepared before the patrol even inserted. Magazines loaded top to bottom with nothing but tracer. Every single round. What happened next, when that contact was initiated, was not what the NVA expected. What happened next was what I spent weeks trying to understand. And what changed, permanently, the way I think about the relationship between deception and firepower. When I first started pulling on this thread, I kept running into the same assumption. Tracer rounds, everyone agreed, were a liability in jungle warfare. The principle was so widely understood, it had become something close to a military proverb. Tracers work both ways. The logic was airtight. A tracer round burns at roughly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit from the moment it leaves the barrel. In daylight, it's a streak of light. At night, it's a Roman candle. The shooter can see exactly where his rounds are going, and so can everyone within a kilometer who happens to be watching. Load too many tracers, the thinking went, and you were essentially sending the enemy a flare that said, "Here I am. Here is my position. Here is exactly where to aim." The standard solution, both in US and Australian doctrine, was the 4-to-1 load. 4 ball rounds, 1 tracer, cycling through the belt or the magazine in a rhythm that gave you just enough trace to walk your fire without lighting yourself up like a signal fire. The M60 machine gun belts came from the factory packed this way. It was a compromise between information and concealment, and it worked. Mostly. American infantry in Vietnam, by the accounts I kept finding, had a complicated relationship with even this compromise. In the chaos of jungle contact, when the enemy was 15 meters away in vegetation so thick you were firing at muzzle flashes rather than targets, tracers were often a psychological comfort more than a tactical tool. Some units loaded denser, running a tracer every 3rd round. Some squad leaders carried a dedicated full tracer magazine for target designation, snapping it in during a firefight to show the M60 gunner where to concentrate. The impulse was understandable. In a jungle that turned every firefight into a blind, deafening, close-range scramble, anything that gave you a sense of where your fire was actually going felt like an advantage. Reading through the American after-action reports from the same period in the same province, I kept finding a pattern. More tracers, more volume, more noise. The American approach to jungle contact was, in its broadest strokes, to generate so much fire so quickly that the enemy could not organize a coherent response. Volume was the answer. Firepower was the philosophy. The Australians had arrived in Vietnam in 1962 with a fundamentally different set of assumptions baked into their training. Not better, necessarily. Different. They had spent the decade before Vietnam in the Malayan emergency and the Indonesian confrontation, fighting a jungle war where the enemy was also disciplined, also patient, and also capable of disappearing into vegetation before you had finished pulling the trigger. They had learned at Canungra, the Australian Army's jungle warfare school in Queensland, that the jungle did not reward volume. It rewarded silence, fire discipline, the willingness to hold a position and wait rather than blaze and run. One Viet Cong commander, captured and interviewed after the war, put it plainly. I have read this quote in 3 separate sources, and I want to be careful not to overstate what it proves. But the pattern it describes is consistent with everything else I found. He said, worse than the Americans were the Australians. The American style was to hit us, then call for planes and artillery. Our response was to break contact and disappear if we could. The Australians were more patient than the Americans, better guerrilla fighters, better at ambushes. They liked to stay with us instead of calling in the planes. We were more afraid of their style. That difference in style, patience versus volume, concealment versus firepower, was the context in which the all-tracer tactic was born. But when I finally understood what the SAS were actually doing with those fully loaded tracer magazines, I realized it wasn't a refinement of the concealment philosophy at all. It was something more paradoxical and more brilliant. To understand why the all-tracer tactic worked, you have to understand what the Australian SAS was doing in Vietnam in the first place, and how radically different that mission was from anything the Americans were running at scale. The 1 Squadron SAS deployed to Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966. They were not there to hold ground. They were not there to generate body counts. They were there to operate as what one intelligence officer described as the eyes and ears of the task force. Small reconnaissance patrols inserted deep into denied territory, tasked with finding enemy base camps, tracking movement, calling in fire missions, and gathering the kind of granular intelligence that you can only get from men who have spent 10 days watching and listening to a single valley. The standard SAS patrol in Vietnam was 5 men. 5. Operating up to 30 kilometers from the nearest friendly force, often in areas where the enemy population was counted in hundreds or thousands. The arithmetic of that situation produced a tactical doctrine that was, by necessity, almost fanatical in its emphasis on concealment. Speed of movement, silence, no cooking fires, no cleared sleeping positions, radio only in emergencies. The patrol was a ghost. The patrol was not supposed to be found. The problem was that sometimes it was. Contact in those circumstances, a 5-man patrol bumping into an NVA main force unit or a sizable VC platoon, created a crisis that no amount of training could fully prepare you for. The standard response, contact drills, called for immediate, violent fire to break the enemy's reaction cycle, then extraction. Hit hard, create confusion, fall back, call for support. But the jungle had its own rules. Helicopters couldn't always get in. Artillery had dead time. and an NVA unit that realized it had found a 5-man patrol. 5 men with finite ammunition, finite explosives, no armor, no indirect fire support on immediate call, had every incentive to pursue, to fix the patrol, to destroy it before help arrived. It was in that specific tactical problem that the all-tracer concept emerged. The logic, when I finally found a clear explanation of it in a veteran's account, was almost elegant in its simplicity. When a gun fires tracer rounds in a darkened jungle, what does the enemy see? Streaks of burning light. Multiple streaks, from multiple positions, from multiple directions. What does he hear? The crack of multiple weapons. What does he know? Almost nothing with certainty. He knows he is receiving fire. He knows it is heavy. What he does not know, what he cannot know in that instant, is whether he is facing 5 men or 50. And in the seconds that count, in the moment of initiation when an ambush breaks and the NVA commander is making the split-second decision to fix and destroy or break contact and report, those seconds of uncertainty could be everything. The Kanangra training had introduced fire discipline not merely as a survival skill, but as a force multiplier. A small patrol that controlled its fire, that could look and sound and feel like something much larger, was not a 5-man patrol anymore. It was a question mark. And an NVA commander who was not certain what he was facing had very good reasons, given Australian ambush reputation, to be conservative. The tracer tactic was, in its essence, the weaponization of uncertainty. The September 1969 contact that opened this script is documented, though its specific details appear in after-action summaries rather than named veteran memoirs. A limitation I want to be honest about. What is thoroughly documented is the class of engagement it represents. Small SAS patrols initiating contact with or receiving contact from enemy forces that vastly outnumbered them, and using the tracer technique to shape the enemy's decision-making in the critical opening seconds. Here is what the tactic looked like in practice. Reconstructed from the pattern of multiple accounts, the patrol has established that it is facing a significant enemy force. Contact is either imminent or has already been initiated. The patrol commander signals the switch to tracer-loaded magazines that were prepared and carried specifically for this contingency, identifiable by feel or by tape color in the dark. Every man loads. The patrol spreads, maximizing the apparent frontage of the position. And then the fire begins. What the enemy experiences is not the rhythmic pulse of a 4-to-1 load, 1 streak in 5, but a continuous, overlapping, intersecting pattern of tracer fire that fills the visual field from multiple angles. Every round is burning. Every burst is visible. The jungle in front of them appears to be filled with firing positions. The volume of tracer in the chaos of initial contact does not read as 5 men with full tracer. It reads as a force with depth, with breadth, with prepared positions. The psychological impact of that was not theoretical. It was documented in NVA and VC behavior in the aftermath of contacts where the technique was employed. Units broke contact. Units that had every numerical advantage, every tactical reason to press forward and fix a small patrol, instead chose to report upward and withdraw. The Australian SAS killed ratio in Vietnam, verified across multiple sources as exceeding 30-to-1, was built in part on engagements where the enemy chose not to fight because the enemy did not know what it was fighting. But there was a second, equally important dimension to this tactic, and it took me a while to find it in the record. The SAS operated in an intelligence environment. Their patrols were not just weapons, they were sensors. A patrol that survived a contact intact, broke away cleanly, and called in a grid reference for an enemy force was infinitely more valuable than a patrol that had been destroyed or forced into a desperate defensive fight waiting for extraction. The tracer technique was not just about surviving the contact. It was about controlling the contact so completely that the patrol could dictate the outcome. Multiple after-action reports from SAS patrols in Phuoc Tuy during 1968 and 1969 describe engagements in which a patrol initiated contact with a larger force, delivered a controlled burst of fire, including tracer, and then immediately withdrew on a pre-planned route while the enemy was still processing what had happened to them. By the time the NVA commander had organized a pursuit, the patrol was gone. 3 hours later, a fire mission would come in on the coordinates where the NVA had been, because the patrol had survived to call it. The contrast with how a similar contact might have played out for an American patrol, drawing on the accounts I found, is instructive. American patrols under similar ambush contact tended to go immediately to maximum volume. Full auto, every man firing, suppression as the primary goal. That approach generated noise and confusion, but it also generated muzzle flashes, position signatures, and a rate of ammunition expenditure that created its own crisis. In the same jungle, facing the same enemy, the American patrol was often fighting to stay alive. The Australian patrol was fighting to control what happened next. One senior NVA officer, whose account appears in a post-war Vietnamese military history, described the difficulty of engaging Australian patrols in terms that stay with me. We could not determine their strength. We could not determine their positions. Our units reported contacts where they believed they had found a strong force, and when we investigated, we found that we had been engaged by a small team. This was disorienting to our commanders. That disorientation was the point. That was the weapon. The tactic did not stay static. The more I mapped the SAS patrol reports chronologically, the more clearly I could see it being refined and expanded as both sides adapted. The initial use of full tracer magazines appears to have been, in part, improvised. Individual patrol commanders making a field judgment about what would work in a specific situation. But by 1968, the evidence suggests the technique had been absorbed into SAS patrol doctrine more formally. Preparation of tracer-loaded magazines became a pre-patrol task. Patrol commanders briefed their men specifically on when to make the switch and how to spread to maximize apparent frontage when they did. The Australians also began layering additional deception elements on top of the tracer technique. Patrol members moved to different positions between bursts so that the points of origin of tracer fire appeared to shift, consistent with a larger unit maneuvering rather than a static small team. Some patrols used their limited explosives to detonate claymores during the initial contact burst, adding the signature of crew-served weapons to what the enemy was hearing and seeing. The overall impression constructed for the enemy in those critical opening seconds was not 5 men with tracers, but organized, positioned, multi-element force. The NVA adapted, as they always did. The adaptation the SAS records most consistently describe is increased caution among NVA units operating in areas known to be under Australian patrol coverage. Units that had previously moved freely through Phuoc Tuy began moving differently, more dispersed, more careful about halting at uncertain contacts rather than pressing forward. From one perspective, this represented a failure of the tactic. The NVA were learning. From another perspective, this was precisely what the tactic was designed to produce. An NVA force that was moving cautiously and halting frequently was an NVA force that was moving slowly, covering less ground and providing more time for the task force to position itself. On the American side, the contrast remained stark throughout this period. American long-range reconnaissance patrols, the LRRPs, developed their own versions of fire and fade techniques. But the underlying philosophy of American operations in the same province, at the same time, was fundamentally different. where the Australians were trying to use a handful of men to shape the behavior of a much larger enemy force through deception and unpredictability, the American approach continued to emphasize generating enough fires to overwhelm. Artillery on short call, air support on short call. The firepower was real, and it was effective in its own terms. But it required the patrol to survive long enough to call it, and it required the enemy to oblige by staying in place while the response was organized. In the records from 1968 and 1969, I found accounts of NVA units that had broken contact with Australian patrols specifically because they did not know what they were dealing with, and then been caught in fire missions called by the same patrol they had just walked away from. This pattern repeats enough times in the after-action record that it clearly represents doctrine rather than accident. The tracer tactic was, at its deepest level, a recognition that information was a weapon. The Australians were not just trying to kill NVA soldiers. They were trying to control what NVA commanders knew and believed. And in that competition, the competition to shape the enemy's understanding of reality, 4 men with full tracer magazines were, for the critical duration of a jungle contact, worth 100. By the time the Australian SAS completed its Vietnam commitment in 1971, the numbers assembled from the record are stark. The 1 Squadron SASR conducted approximately 1,200 combat patrols during their Vietnam service. Against those patrols, spread across years of operations in terrain the enemy knew better than anyone, the SAS suffered 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. Against enemy forces, the confirmed kill ratio exceeded 30-1. I want to be careful with those numbers because they require context. The SAS was not line infantry. They were not holding fire bases or taking hills. They were choosing their contacts carefully, initiating on their own terms where possible, and disengaging when the equation changed. The 30-1 ratio is not a measure of the same kind of fighting that the infantry battalions were doing. It is a measure of something else, of what a highly trained small force can accomplish when it controls the terms of engagement. The tracer deception tactic was one part of that control, but its impact radiated outward. Every NVA unit that broke contact with a 4-man patrol because it believed it had encountered a larger force was a unit that had effectively been defeated without being destroyed. Its commander had made a choice based on false information. That choice had costs, operational costs, tempo costs, the cost of reporting upward and waiting for orders rather than acting on the intelligence of a contact. And those costs accumulated across hundreds of patrols, across years of operations. The NVA response that I found most telling in the record came not from a battlefield account, but from a command document. At some point in the later years of Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy, NVA local and regional commanders issued guidance forbidding their units from initiating ambushes on Australian patrols without explicit higher command approval. The reasoning, as I understand it from the secondary accounts that reference this document, was that the cost-benefit calculation for engaging Australian units had become unfavorable, too uncertain, too dangerous. The Australians might be 4 men, or they might be 40, and the price of guessing wrong was not worth the tactical gain. That document, if accurately described in the sources I found, represents something extraordinary. An enemy force that had sustained its campaign for decades, that had defeated the French and was in the process of outlasting the Americans, had looked at a force of 120 Australians and decided to issue standing orders to avoid them. The tracer technique did not achieve that alone. Australian training, patrol discipline, ambush skill, and the accumulated reputation of the SAS all contributed to that outcome. But the tracer tactic was the sharp edge of a specific capability, the ability to convince an enemy in the instant that mattered that the force he was facing was not the force he was actually facing. The Australian SAS left Vietnam in 1971. The larger war continued for 4 more years and ended the way it ended. The lessons of Phuoc Tuy, by most accounts, were not systematically absorbed into the American approach before the war concluded. The philosophy of overwhelming firepower remained dominant. The patience and deception that had defined Australian operations remained a niche capability rather than a model. But those lessons did not disappear. The post-Vietnam Australian Army carried them forward into its doctrine, and Australian Special Operations Forces have maintained a version of that patrol philosophy through subsequent decades. The emphasis on small unit independence, fire discipline, and the weaponization of uncertainty shaped how Australia approached its special operations commitments in East Timor, Afghanistan, and beyond. And the tracers. The specific logic of the all-tracer tactic, using your own visibility not as a weakness to be managed, but as a tool to be deployed, shows up again and again in the history of unconventional warfare. The Rhodesian SAS scouts used denser tracer loading to simulate superior forces in contacts during their own bush war. Special operations units in multiple subsequent conflicts have applied variants of the same principle: that an enemy who is uncertain is an enemy who is manageable. What this research left me with is something I did not expect when I started. I had assumed this was a story about a clever trick, a magazine loading technique, a tactical curiosity. But the more I read, the more I understood that the tracer tactic was not the point. It was a symptom. The point was that 4 Australians in a jungle had looked at 30 NVA soldiers and asked, not can we survive this, but can we control this? And then, with 4 magazines and a shared understanding of exactly what they were doing and why, they answered their own question. That is not a trick, that is a philosophy. And in Phuoc Tuy Province, in 1969, that philosophy was worth more than any number of tracers burning in the dark.